Your soulmate wants you to know what happened yesterday. Open this now. Something quietly shifted yesterday, and the person who has been carrying you in their thoughts realized they couldn't keep pretending everything was the same. They paused in the middle of an ordinary moment. Their smile disappeared. A conversation around them faded into the background. For just a second, it felt as though time had stopped, because something reminded them of you in a way they never expected. Not a photograph. Not a message. Just a tiny detail that suddenly connected every unanswered question they had been trying to ignore. And if you're still here, don't look away yet, because the next few moments reveal why yesterday may have changed everything they wanted to tell you. Picture a quiet afternoon filled with everyday noise. Cars passing. Coffee cooling on a nearby table. Friends talking about completely unrelated things. Then someone casually mentioned a story about taking second chances, and without warning, your soulmate became unusually silent. They weren't listening anymore. Their eyes drifted toward a distant window while everyone else continued speaking. It wasn't sadness that appeared across their face. It was recognition. The kind that arrives after weeks of confusion. They finally understood that every attempt to distract themselves had quietly led them back to the same place. Back to thoughts of you. But what happened only minutes later made that realization impossible to hide. Someone noticed the change in their expression and asked a simple question: "Who are you thinking about?" Instead of answering immediately, they smiled in a way no one there had ever seen before. That silence said more than any words could have. Stay close, because one unexpected choice turned that private moment into something much bigger. As the evening unfolded, another surprise quietly entered the story. Your soulmate found themselves walking somewhere they hadn't planned to visit. Every step felt strangely familiar, almost as if yesterday itself was guiding them toward a forgotten memory. They stopped near a place that reminded them of a conversation they wished had lasted longer. They could almost hear laughter that existed only in memory. They stood there longer than they intended, wondering why certain connections refuse to disappear no matter how much life changes around them. Then something completely unexpected happened. Their phone lit up. It wasn't a dramatic message. It wasn't an emergency. It was something so ordinary that most people would have ignored it. Yet to them, it felt like the missing piece of a puzzle they had been trying to solve for months. In that instant, they realized the story wasn't about coincidence anymore. It was about timing. Before you click away, there's one detail you haven't uncovered yet, because what they decided to do after seeing that screen is the very reason this message found you today. The moment their screen went dark again, they didn't put the phone back into their pocket. They simply held it there, staring at the reflection of their own face as if they were looking at someone who had finally stopped running. Yesterday had quietly stripped away every excuse they had been hiding behind. For weeks they had convinced themselves that silence was safer than honesty, that waiting was wiser than speaking, and that eventually their feelings would fade on their own. But yesterday proved the opposite. Every step they took led them back to the same thought, and every distraction only made your presence stronger in their heart. Then someone close to them noticed the unusual calm in their eyes and asked, "Have you finally figured out what you've been searching for?" This time they didn't hesitate. They answered with a gentle smile that carried more certainty than words ever could. They admitted that there was one person they couldn't stop thinking about, one connection that refused to disappear no matter how much life kept moving forward. That confession wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. Yet it changed the atmosphere around them completely. The people sitting nearby exchanged quiet smiles because they had sensed this truth long before your soulmate was ready to admit it. If this story is keeping you curious so far, consider sharing it with someone who enjoys meaningful stories like these, and if you haven't already, subscribing helps you catch every new chapter as it arrives. But don't leave now, because the most surprising part of yesterday hadn't even happened yet. As night slowly settled in, your soulmate decided to do something they had postponed again and again. They opened an old collection of memories. Not to live in the past, but to understand why certain moments still felt so alive. They smiled at conversations that once seemed ordinary but now carried unexpected meaning. They remembered little details that nobody else would have noticed, a laugh that stayed in their mind longer than it should have, a sentence that echoed for days afterward, a quiet goodbye that somehow never felt like an ending. Suddenly, every memory connected like pieces of one larger picture. It wasn't about regret anymore. It was about clarity. They finally understood that the strongest connections are often built through countless small moments rather than one dramatic event. That realization filled them with a calm confidence they hadn't experienced in a very long time. Instead of wondering what might happen someday, they began wondering what could happen if they finally stopped hiding their heart. There's another layer to this that almost nobody sees at first glance, and it's waiting just ahead. Before the day finally came to an end, your soulmate made one last quiet decision that no one else witnessed. They promised themselves they would stop letting fear write the next chapter of their story. They looked out into the night, took a slow breath, and imagined what it would feel like if honesty finally replaced hesitation. For the first time in a long while, the future didn't seem uncertain, it felt full of possibility. They realized that yesterday wasn't simply another day passing by. It had become a turning point, the moment when confusion gave way to understanding and hesitation slowly transformed into hope. Yet one final piece is still missing from everything you've heard. There's something your soulmate has not spoken aloud yet, something they carried home with them after yesterday ended. That unspoken truth is powerful enough to change the direction of this entire story, and when it finally comes to light, you'll understand why yesterday was only the beginning of everything that is about to unfold. Morning arrived, but something inside your soulmate hadn't returned to normal. They woke earlier than usual, not because of an alarm, but because the thoughts they carried home yesterday refused to stay quiet. Sunlight slipped through the window, filling the room with a warm glow, yet their attention remained fixed on one question that had followed them through the entire night: what if this connection has been waiting for the right moment all along? Instead of rushing into another busy day, they sat in complete silence, replaying every meaningful moment that had led them here. What surprised them most wasn't the memories themselves, it was how peaceful they suddenly felt. The confusion that had clouded their heart was beginning to disappear. They realized they had spent far too much time searching for perfect timing while life had been quietly placing meaningful signs in front of them all along. Then, just as they stood to leave, something unexpected caught their attention. A familiar song began playing nearby. It wasn't planned. It wasn't extraordinary to anyone else. But to them, it felt like the final reminder they needed. They smiled without even realizing it. There was one detail hidden inside that ordinary moment, and once they noticed it, they knew they couldn't keep pretending everything was simply a coincidence. Stay with this, because the next discovery explains why yesterday continues to echo into today. Later that day, they crossed paths with someone who had no idea what had happened yesterday. The conversation started casually, filled with everyday topics and easy laughter. Then, almost without thinking, that person asked a simple question: "What's different about you today? You seem lighter somehow." Your soulmate paused before answering. They couldn't explain everything that had changed, because even they were still discovering it themselves. But they admitted something they had never said out loud before. They confessed that they had stopped focusing on what could go wrong and had finally started paying attention to what truly mattered. They spoke about realizing that some people enter your life for a reason that's impossible to measure with logic alone. Those words surprised even them. For months, they had hidden behind uncertainty, but now honesty came naturally. As the conversation ended, the other person smiled and quietly said, "Then maybe it's time to stop waiting." Those simple words stayed with your soulmate long after they walked away. They weren't a prediction. They weren't advice. They were a gentle reminder that some opportunities quietly fade if they remain unspoken for too long. But the most meaningful moment of the day still hadn't happened. As evening approached once again, your soulmate found themselves standing beneath a sky painted with soft colors, watching the world slow down around them. People hurried home. Lights began appearing in nearby windows. Everything looked ordinary, yet inside, everything felt wonderfully different. They closed their eyes for just a moment and imagined what they would say if they finally had the chance to speak without fear, without hesitation, and without overthinking every word. They realized the message they had been trying to protect wasn't complicated at all. It was honest. It was simple. It was waiting. And for the very first time, they stopped asking whether the moment would ever arrive. Instead, they quietly decided they would be ready when it did. Still, one final piece remains hidden from you. Before yesterday ended, your soulmate made a choice that nobody else knows about, a choice so personal that they haven't shared it with a single soul. When that decision finally comes into the light, every unanswered question from this story will suddenly make perfect sense, and that's where everything changes once again. Long after the city had settled into its evening rhythm, your soulmate found themselves writing words they never expected to write. It wasn't a dramatic letter, and it wasn't meant for anyone else's eyes. It was simply an honest page filled with thoughts they had been carrying for far too long. Line after line, they admitted the things they had been too afraid to say aloud. They wrote about the strange peace they felt after yesterday, about how one ordinary day had quietly transformed into the moment that changed their perspective. They realized they had spent so much time trying to protect themselves from disappointment that they had almost missed the beauty of being completely honest. When they finished, they didn't rush to hide the page. Instead, they read it one more time with a smile that looked lighter than ever before. They finally understood that courage doesn't always arrive with loud declarations. Sometimes it begins with one quiet decision to stop pretending your heart feels nothing. If this story has stayed with you until now, consider sharing it with someone who enjoys heartfelt journeys like this, and if you'd like to hear where this story leads next, subscribing is a simple way to stay connected. But don't leave yet, because what happened immediately after they closed that notebook changed the direction of everything. As they stood by the window, their phone vibrated once more. This time, they didn't rush to check it. They took a deep breath first, almost as if they already knew that whatever appeared on the screen wasn't the real reason their heart was racing. When they finally looked, it was another ordinary notification that most people would have dismissed within seconds. Yet it gently reminded them of a promise they had made to themselves only hours earlier, to stop letting hesitation decide their future. They smiled, slipped the phone back into their pocket, and stepped outside for a slow walk beneath the evening sky. Every familiar street suddenly felt different. Every passing face seemed to remind them that life keeps moving whether we choose to act or not. Somewhere along that quiet walk, they whispered something to themselves that no one else could hear. When the next opportunity comes, I won't let fear answer for me. That single sentence carried more weight than they realized. It wasn't spoken for dramatic effect. It was a commitment to the person they were becoming. There's still one hidden piece of yesterday that hasn't been revealed, and once you discover it, every small moment you've heard so far will fit together perfectly. Before the night finally came to an end, your soulmate looked back at everything that had unfolded since yesterday began. They no longer saw random moments scattered across an ordinary day. They saw a path that had quietly guided them from uncertainty toward clarity, one conversation, one memory, and one realization at a time. What surprised them most was that nothing extraordinary had happened on the surface. There were no grand gestures, no impossible coincidences, and no dramatic interruptions. The real transformation had happened inside them. Yesterday had given them something they hadn't carried in a very long time, a quiet confidence that the right words no longer needed to be hidden forever. Yet even after reaching that understanding, they held on to one final secret. There is still a message they haven't shared with anyone, a message they believe deserves the perfect moment rather than the fastest one. And when that moment finally arrives, you'll understand why everything that happened yesterday wasn't the ending of this story at all, it was only the beginning of the message they have been waiting to tell you. Just when it seemed the story had reached its quiet conclusion, another unexpected chapter began to unfold. The following morning, your soulmate carried yesterday's discoveries into a brand new day, but something felt noticeably different. The uncertainty that had followed them for so long was no longer leading the way. Instead, there was a calm determination in every step they took. They found themselves smiling at little things they would normally overlook, a stranger holding the door open, sunlight reflecting across a window, the familiar sound of laughter drifting through the air. It wasn't because the world had suddenly changed. It was because they had. Yesterday had quietly reminded them that meaningful connections are not built through perfect timing alone but through the courage to recognize what truly matters before it's too late. As they continued through the day, one thought kept returning again and again: some stories are worth finishing. That single realization became impossible to ignore. They understood that waiting forever would never create the future they secretly hoped for. The next step would require honesty, patience, and confidence. But there was still one final piece they hadn't revealed, not because they wanted to hide it, but because they wanted it to be spoken with complete sincerity when the right moment arrived. Later that afternoon, something happened that made everything feel even more real. Your soulmate crossed paths with someone who unknowingly asked a simple but unforgettable question: if you could say one thing to the person who has been on your mind lately, what would it be? For a brief moment, they didn't answer. They simply looked ahead with a thoughtful smile, imagining the conversation they had replayed countless times in their heart. Then, almost in a whisper, they replied, "I'd tell them they mattered far more than they ever realized." Those words surprised even them because they came without hesitation. There was no rehearsed speech, no complicated explanation, just genuine honesty. The person beside them smiled knowingly, almost as if they could sense that this answer had been waiting to be spoken for a very long time. As the conversation ended, your soulmate walked away feeling lighter than they had in months. The fear of saying too much had quietly disappeared, replaced by the excitement of finally being authentic. Stay with this just a little longer, because the final truth behind everything that happened yesterday is closer than ever, and it's the piece that gives every previous moment its true meaning. As evening settled once again, your soulmate returned to the same place where yesterday's journey had quietly begun. The surroundings looked exactly the same, yet nothing felt familiar anymore because they were seeing everything through different eyes. They paused, took one slow breath, and realized that yesterday had never been about coincidence. It had been about awakening to feelings they could no longer deny and finding the courage to stop hiding behind uncertainty. In that peaceful moment, they made one final promise to themselves: when the opportunity finally arrives, they will speak with complete honesty, without fear, without overthinking, and without letting another meaningful moment pass by unnoticed. That promise became the silent ending to yesterday's remarkable story, and the quiet beginning of everything still waiting ahead. But one final message remains unspoken. It's the message your soulmate has been carrying ever since yesterday changed everything, and when those words are finally shared, you'll understand why every conversation, every pause, every smile, and every unexpected turn in this journey was leading toward one unforgettable moment that is about to arrive.